What does it mean when a single object unsettles an entire story about who we were? History is often told like a staircase. One step leads to the next. Stone becomes bronze, bronze becomes iron, and knowledge advances in a patient, orderly line. We like that version because it is tidy. It suggests the human journey can be mapped, labeled, and understood. But every so often, something rises from the ground that refuses to stay in its assigned century. A carved figure, a metal fragment, a map of the sky made too early, too precisely by hands we thought knew less than they did. These discoveries do not necessarily overturn everything. More often, they ask for something harder from us. Humility, the willingness to admit that the past is not a finished book, but a manuscript with missing pages, blurred margins, and whole chapters torn away by time. What survives is never the full record. It is only what stone protected, what peat preserved, what chance allowed us to find. In this journey, we move through ancient hills, buried temples, mountain plateaus, and museum rooms lit with soft glass and silence. We will meet objects that seem to stand between worlds, practical and ceremonial, familiar and impossible, intimate and immense. Some may have ordinary explanations. Some may remain unresolved. That tension matters, because the true drama is not whether the past hid superhuman secrets. It is whether we have underestimated the patience, imagination, and intelligence of those who came before us. Perhaps that is the deeper mystery, not that ancient people knew too much, but that we have so often imagined they knew too little. And so we begin with a circle of bronze pulled from darkness, carrying on its surface a sky that still feels alive. It began as so many discoveries do, not with certainty, but with a chance interruption. In the spring of 1900, sponge divers sheltering from the rough seas dropped anchor near a small Greek island called Antikythera. The water below seemed ordinary enough, deep and blue and full of silence. But when one diver descended, he did not return with shells or coral. He came back shaken, speaking of bodies on the seafloor. Statues, horses, a wreck from another age lying in pieces beneath the current. What followed was part rescue, part excavation, part bewilderment. Bronze limbs, marble faces, and fragments of cargo were raised from the wreck and carried into daylight. Among them was a lump of corroded metal so unremarkable that it might easily have been dismissed as debris. For a time, it was little more than a cracked mass of green-brown decay. Then someone noticed a gear tooth, then another. Slowly, a different kind of artifact emerged from the corrosion, not a sculpture, not a weapon, but a machine. Inside that hardened shell was an arrangement of interlocking bronze gears of startling complexity. Dials, scales, inscriptions, a mechanism built to model celestial cycles with extraordinary precision. It could track the motions of the sun and moon, anticipate eclipses, and translate the heavens into turning metal. In spirit, it felt less like an ornament from antiquity and more like a message from a workshop centuries ahead of its time. And that was the unsettling part. We are comfortable imagining the ancient world as philosophical, artistic, and observant. We are less prepared to imagine it as mechanically intricate in ways that resemble much later technologies. The Antikythera Mechanism did not suggest magic. It suggested craftsmanship so exact and astronomical knowledge so disciplined that modern categories suddenly felt too narrow. Maybe history does not move in a straight line after all. Maybe brilliance appears, disappears, and waits in the dark until someone is ready to recognize it. Imagine a workshop lit by oil flame, where bronze dust hangs in the air and every sound carries meaning. A file against metal, a measured breath, the quiet click of teeth being tested, adjusted, and tested again. Somewhere in the Hellenistic world, hands shaped a machine that did not conquer land or win a battle. It measured time itself. As scholars began to understand the Antikythera Mechanism, the deeper astonishment was not only its complexity, but its purpose. This was not a toy and not a curiosity. It was a way of thinking made visible. By turning a handle, the user could bring the sky into motion and watch cycles unfold. Lunar phases, eclipse predictions, recurring patterns that linked human life to the regular pulse of the cosmos. The device made the heavens portable. It translated observation into structure and structure into understanding. That achievement matters because it reveals something easy to forget. Ancient intelligence was not abstract in the way we often imagine. It was embodied. Mathematical insight lived in bronze and wood. Astronomy moved through gears. Knowledge was not merely written down, it was built. The mechanism stands as evidence that science, craftsmanship, and philosophy were not separate worlds, but neighboring rooms in the same house. And yet, there is a quiet sorrow attached to it. If one such machine existed, perhaps others did too. If this level of precision was possible, what else has been lost? Fire, war, salt water, neglect, empire, collapse. History preserves fragments, not full libraries. We may be seeing not the beginning of a tradition, but the lone survivor of one. That is what gives the object its emotional weight. It is not only a marvel, it is a remainder, a witness to a line of thought broken somewhere behind us. And once we accept that the past may have been richer than the record suggests, other discoveries begin to look different. A carved stone is no longer just a stone. It becomes a question waiting beneath the dust. What if the oldest map of the heavens in Europe was not painted on parchment, but hammered into bronze and buried in the earth? The story of the Nebra Sky Disc begins not in a temple or a royal archive, but in secrecy. In '99, authorities in Germany intercepted an object moving through the illegal antiquities trade, a bronze circle darkened by age and marked with thin shapes of gold. At first glance, it looked ceremonial, even beautiful in a quiet, ancient way. But the longer scholars studied it, the more unsettling it became. This was not simply decoration. It was observation. Across its surface were a crescent moon, a radiant orb, and a scattering of stars, among them a cluster many identify with the Pleiades. Two arcs along the edge appeared to mark the angle between summer and winter solstice sunrises at the latitude where the disk had been found. In other words, this object may have helped people align earthly life with celestial time. Sowing, harvest, ritual, waiting for the seasons to turn. The sky was not above them in some abstract sense. It was part of survival. That is what makes the disk so moving. It comes from Bronze Age Central Europe, a world often described as peripheral to the great centers of ancient learning. Yet here is evidence of careful skywatching carried out not for a moment, but across generations. Someone had to notice patterns, remember them, compare them, teach them. Knowledge like this does not appear in a flash. It is accumulated with patience, almost devotion. The Nebra Disc asks us to reconsider what sophistication looks like. Perhaps wisdom is not always written in books or preserved in marble halls. Sometimes it is carried by farmers, metal workers, and watchers of the horizon. And once a culture learns to read the sky with such intimacy, another question follows naturally. What else were ancient eyes able to see? It started with footsteps in the dark, echoing through a cave in southern France. In 1990, a group of explorers moved through a narrow, streaming interrupted, waiting for the complete message. What do we do with an image that seems to belong to the wrong century? Deep inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, the air changes. The passageways narrow. Light falls away. Stone gathers silence. And on the walls of those lower chambers, carved with the same care as every sacred scene above, are reliefs that have troubled the modern imagination for decades. To some viewers, they look uncannily familiar. Elongated forms like glass bulbs, a serpent stretching through the center, a base that resembles a socket, a line trailing outward like a cord. It is easy to see why these carvings have inspired technological comparisons. The resemblance is striking, almost theatrical. Yet resemblance is not proof. Egypt was a civilization of layered symbols, where images were rarely literal and often carried several meanings at once. Mainstream interpretation sees these forms not as devices but as religious expressions. The serpent as divine force, the enclosing shape as a womb, a vessel, or a cosmic container. The whole scene part of a sacred language we only partly understand. And still, questions linger. The temple's inner spaces were painted and worked in rooms where open flame would have left traces over time. Yet some ceilings remain remarkably clean. Explanations exist. Reflected light, careful ventilation, ritual use of lamps in limited ways. None of them is impossible, but none fully quiets the sense that we are looking at a puzzle whose pieces come from two different worlds, one symbolic, one practical. Perhaps that is the lesson Dendera offers. The past does not become clearer simply because we stare harder. Sometimes it becomes more layered, more human, more elusive. Maybe the real mystery is not whether the ancient Egyptians possessed forgotten machines, but whether we still know how to read a civilization that thought in images deeper than our own. High in the Peruvian Andes, where wind moves over stone like an old memory, lies a place that seems less built than summoned. Sacsayhuamán rises above Cusco in vast terraces of fitted rock, each block immense, angled, and so precisely joined that even now a blade struggles to pass between them. Standing there, the first feeling is not simply admiration, it is scale. Human scale gives way to something older, quieter, and harder to explain. The stones are the heart of the question. Some weigh many tons. Their surfaces curve and lock together in irregular patterns that look almost fluid, as if the wall had grown rather than been assembled. Modern visitors often ask the same thing. How were these moved, shaped, and fitted with such confidence on steep ground, at high altitude, without iron tools in the European sense, and without machines we would recognize today? The temptation is to leap toward extraordinary answers, but the more enduring answer may be even more impressive. Time, coordination, inherited skill, and labor organized on a civilizational scale. The Inca and the cultures before them understood stone not as inert material, but as something to negotiate with. They read the mountain, worked with fault lines, adjusted to weight and terrain. Their architecture was not only about strength, it was about relationship between empire and landscape, ritual and defense, geometry and earth. A wall like this could endure earthquakes not by resisting movement absolutely, but by absorbing it. That is not primitive engineering. It is intelligent adaptation. And yet there is still wonder here, and wonder deserves its place. Because even when we reject fantasy, the achievement remains difficult to fathom. It forces us to confront a habit of mind that measures sophistication too narrowly, as if precision belongs only to modern industry. Sacsayhuamán does not ask us to believe in lost superpowers. It asks something more unsettling. It asks whether human capability has always exceeded the stories later ages tell about it. If stone can remember the hand that shaped it, then Pumapunku feels like memory broken and scattered across a plain. On the high Bolivian plateau near Tiwanaku and the cold shimmer of Lake Titicaca, enormous blocks lie strewn as if a structure had been opened by force and left unfinished by time. Some are red sandstone, massive and weathered. Others are harder in density, cut with crisp angles, channels, and interior corners that still seem startlingly exact. The most famous pieces are the so-called H blocks, repeated forms whose symmetry gives them an almost modular appearance. To modern eyes, they can look less like ancient masonry than components from an industrial yard. That impression has fueled endless speculation. How were such forms measured? How were they transported? Why do some cuts appear so precise? The altitude alone makes the site feel improbable. But improbability is not the same as impossibility. Archaeology points toward skilled stoneworking, abrasion, hammerstones, patient finishing, and a cultural world capable of planning at monumental scale. Precision does not require machines in the modern sense. It requires standards, repetition, trained vision, in a society willing to invest labor in meaning. And meaning is everywhere at Pumapunku. These stones were not merely structural. They belonged to a ceremonial landscape, to a civilization shaped by movement, trade ritual, and the power of place. Architecture here was a language. Alignment, proportion, and material were part of how communities expressed order in a vast and demanding environment. What appears mechanical to us may have been, for them, spiritual and social at once. Still, the site unsettles because it resists easy closure. Ruin magnifies mystery. When walls collapse and context is lost, fragments begin to speak too loudly on their own. We see their sharpness, but not always the generations of work behind it. Perhaps that is why Pumapunku holds the imagination so firmly. It reminds us that when history breaks apart, the surviving pieces can seem almost alien. Yet what they may reveal in the end is not something beyond humanity, but the scale of human patience when belief and craft move together. What if one of the oldest stories of distance was written not in words, but in roads? Long before the modern world bound continents with rail lines and fiber optic cables, the Roman Empire stitched together an enormous geography through stone, discipline, and repetition. Roads crossed provinces, cut through mountains, spanned rivers, and linked ports to forts, farms to cities, one horizon to another. Their purpose was practical: move armies, carry messages, sustain trade. But over time, they became something larger. They turned territory into connection. They gave shape to the idea that a civilization could hold itself together across great space. What still astonishes is how many of these roads endured. In some places, their lines remain visible from the air, steady as old scars across fields and hills. In others, later streets were built directly over them, as if each century quietly admitted the wisdom of what came before. Their longevity has inspired the familiar phrase that all roads lead to Rome. Yet the deeper truth may be the reverse. Rome reached outward by learning how to make durable pathways where none existed before. There is no mystery here in the supernatural sense. The techniques are known: surveying, drainage, layered foundations, cambered surfaces, relentless labor. And still the achievement feels almost improbable when measured against the fragility of much that came later. Roads are humble things. People rarely gather before them in awe. But perhaps they should. A road is an act of confidence in the future. It assumes someone will come after you, and that their journey matters enough to prepare for. That is why ancient infrastructure can feel strangely intimate. It tells us how a civilization imagined movement, power, and belonging. To build a road is to decide that the world should be more reachable than it is. And once people learn to master distance on land, another ambition begins to stir. They start looking not only across terrain, but upward, toward forces that travel through the air itself. What if the most provocative ancient object is not grand at all, but small enough to fit in the palm of a hand? In the collections of the National Museum of Iraq, there once stood a simple vessel from the Parthian period: a clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod. On its face, it looked modest, almost forgettable beside statues, reliefs, and royal inscriptions. But when its unusual construction was examined in the 20th century, a possibility emerged that has fascinated the public ever since. Could this object, now often called the Baghdad battery, have produced a small electric charge? The idea is easy to understand and difficult to settle. Fill such a vessel with an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice, and in theory, a weak current could be generated. Experiments have shown that something like it can work. That alone is enough to stir the imagination. Suddenly, the artifact seems to reach across time, asking whether ancient artisans may have discovered effects we associate with a much later age. Was it used for electroplating, for ritual demonstration, for medicine? Or is the resemblance misleading and the object better understood as a storage container for scrolls or sacred materials? This is where the story becomes most interesting. The real value of the Baghdad battery may lie not in proving a lost technology, but in showing how fragile interpretation can be. An object survives. Its world does not. The workshop, the gestures, the surrounding tools, the spoken explanations, the ordinary context that once made everything obvious, all of that is gone. We are left with materials and analogy. We compare, infer, imagine. And perhaps that is why the little jar remains so haunting. It sits at the border between evidence and desire. We want the past to surprise us, but we also want it to make sense. The artifact offers both impulses at once. Maybe history is not a courtroom where every mystery ends in a verdict. Maybe it is a conversation with silence, where even a small vessel can illuminate the limits of what we know. Beneath the dry earth of ancient Mesopotamia, whole cities have vanished and returned more than once. Walls collapse, rivers shift, kingdoms fall into dust, and centuries later, a spade touches brick again. That rhythm of disappearance and return is part of what gives archaeology its peculiar power. It is never only about the object. It is about the silence around it and the fragile chain of meaning we try to rebuild. Some discoveries seem to disturb the official timeline because they arrive without enough context to settle them. A mechanism without its workshop, A carved relief without the language that first explained it. A stone fitted so well that later generations doubt their own assumptions. But context is everything. The deeper scholars dig, the more these objects often become less supernatural and more extraordinary in a human sense. What looked impossible begins to reveal planning, repetition, inherited craft, and forms of intelligence that do not fit neatly into modern hierarchies. That shift matters. We have a habit of imagining the ancient world in extremes. Either its people were simple and limited, or they possessed secrets now lost. Both ideas flatten the truth. Most often, the past was neither naive nor magical. It was practical, symbolic, observational, and inventive in ways shaped by local needs and cosmologies. Knowledge could be sophisticated without being industrial. Precision could exist without modern machines. Complexity could flourish and then vanish without leaving a continuous trail into the present. And maybe that is the quieter revelation beneath all these artifacts. The timeline itself is not wrong because it changes. It changes because history is alive. Every generation reopens the record, reads the fragments again, and discovers how much older human imagination may be than its surviving proof. When that realization settles in, the ground beneath the story begins to shift. The question is no longer whether the past was stranger than we thought. The question is whether memory has always been too small for the lives that came before us. Picture a museum after closing. The lights are lowered, glass cases hold their quiet. Labels speak in measured language, but the objects behind them remain older than explanation, patient in a way that human certainty rarely is. To walk among them, even in imagination, is to feel how thin the line can be between confidence and revision. By now, a pattern has begun to emerge. Again and again, the discoveries that trouble official timelines do so not because they prove impossible histories, but because they expose the incompleteness of our own. We build narratives the way ancient builders made walls, carefully with what material is available. But sometimes a new stone appears that does not fit the design. Then the honest response is not panic or fantasy, it is reconstruction. That may be the most mature form of wonder. Not the hunger to be shocked, but the willingness to let evidence enlarge the human story. A bronze gear can remind us that science has deep roots. A sky disc can reveal that astronomy belonged not only to courts and empires, but to communities who watch the seasons with reverence. Monumental stonework can teach us that precision is not the exclusive property of modernity. Even the most disputed artifacts serve a purpose. They keep the conversation open. They protect humility from hardening into dogma. And humility is no small thing. It changes how we look at the past and perhaps how we look at one another. If earlier civilizations were more observant, capable, and imaginative than later eras assumed, then progress itself becomes a more delicate idea. It is not simply a ladder rising upward. It is also a field of losses, recoveries, forgotten methods, vanished schools of thought, and sudden recognitions across time. So the question is no longer only what these artifacts were. It is what they ask of us now, to look longer, to listen more carefully, to accept that truth sometimes arrives not as a final answer, but as a widening horizon. And so we arrive at the deeper tension beneath every ancient mystery, not the contest between believers and skeptics, but the struggle between certainty and attention. The past is easy to misuse. A puzzling artifact can be turned into spectacle. A gap in the record can become an invitation to fantasy. But there is another way to stand before what we do not fully understand. Quietly, patiently, with enough imagination to remain open, and enough discipline to resist filling every silence with invention. That balance is harder than it sounds. It asks us to live with incomplete answers, which may be one of the most difficult forms of knowledge. What these discoveries have shown, taken together, is something both simple and profound. Ancient people were not waiting in darkness for modern minds to explain the world to them. They were already explaining it in stone alignments, in celestial markings, in engineered forms, in tools, roads, rituals, and machines of astonishing subtlety. Their explanations were shaped by different needs and different meanings, but they were no less human for that. They observed, compared, refined, remembered. They taught their children what the sky was doing, how the earth moved underfoot, where the flood would come, when the light would change. If anything, the greatest error may be our own habit of separation. We separate science from symbolism, utility from beauty, measurement from myth, as if earlier cultures did the same. But many ancient worlds held those dimensions together. To know a thing was also to place it within a larger order. The stars were not only data, they were relationship. Stone was not only mass, it was permanence, power, and prayer. Perhaps that is why these objects continue to affect us so deeply. They do more than challenge a timeline. They challenge a mood of superiority that modern life can slip into without noticing. And once that mood begins to fall away, a final question emerges almost on its own. If so much brilliance has already been lost to time, what responsibility do we carry for what we choose to remember now? In the end, the most enduring discovery is not hidden in bronze gears, mountain stones, or buried chambers. It is hidden in our relationship to the unknown. We began with the hope that a handful of artifacts might reveal a secret history, something dramatic enough to rearrange the world in a single gesture. But what they offer is quieter and perhaps more valuable. They remind us that the human story has always been larger than the versions we tell with confidence. Civilizations rise, observe, build, imagine, and disappear. What remains is partial, a fragment of metal, a circle of gold and sky, a wall that still holds, a vessel whose purpose we can only approach by inference. These are not complete messages. They are surviving notes from a conversation interrupted by centuries. And yet, interruption is not the end of meaning. Every generation returns to the record and reads it again. We bring new tools, new questions, and new humility if we are wise enough to keep it. Sometimes we solve an old puzzle. Sometimes we discover that the puzzle was larger than we thought. Either way, the work matters. Because history is not only about the past, it is about the habits of mind we carry into the future. Whether we approach uncertainty with arrogance or patience, whether we demand easy answers or learn to remain present with complexity. That may be the deepest human insight these ancient discoveries leave behind. Knowledge is never only accumulation, it is also restraint. The courage to say we do not yet know. The discipline to keep looking. The tenderness to understand that those who came before us were not shadows waiting for enlightenment, but people as alert to wonder as we are, and perhaps in some ways closer to it. So perhaps the final question is not whether the official timeline can be shattered. Timelines will always change. They should. The real question is whether we can become the kind of people who greet each new fragment of the past not with fear or triumph, but with reverence for how much of being human has always exceeded the record.